Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
Welcome to the North Idaho College Public Forum, and welcome to the 11th of a 12-week series on the topic, Confronting Hate, Humanity's Greatest Challenge. We have had a symposium at North Idaho College in which we had 13 organizations co-sponsoring under the North Idaho College Popcorn Forum, guests and speakers from all over the United States, keynote speakers, panel members, and workshops, as well as concerts and drama productions. On the public forum today, we have chosen to take excerpts from a keynote address by Dr. James Waller, a professor of psychology at Whitworth College. Our guest today will be under the format of giving excerpts from that address rather than panel members asking questions. Dr. Waller holds a PhD in the field of psychology and is a very accomplished author, including a book on evil and how that does address hate. In this address that he gave at North Idaho College, he will be explaining not only the question of hate, but how to combat it, and particularly deal with the world court and how that can be used to deal with individuals who have committed atrocities, even when serving in some dictatorial governments. It is my pleasure to introduce to you, for parts of his keynote address at North Idaho College, the professor of psychology from Whitworth College, Dr. James Waller. Ladies and gentlemen, we do believe that you will very much find this address most worthwhile to you. And here is Dr. Waller.
It's that second area of interest, Holocaust and Genocide studies, that brings me to you today, because I want to talk about the role of the International Criminal Court in confronting the hate that's most often associated with war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes of genocide as well. Now, I also want to say up front, as a bit of a disclaimer, that it seems to me there are two ways you could talk about something like the International Criminal Court. One way would be in the context of a judicial legal framework of how the court can work, the ways in which it shouldn't work, all the nuts and bolts that are going to have to go into what's going to be a tremendously complicated judicial process. As I've already said, that type of judicial legal background is not my background. But I think the second way you can talk about the ICC, and the way I want to talk about it today with you, is from the standpoint of perpetrators. Perpetrators is very much part of my background. As Virginia mentioned, my most recent book, Becoming Evil, is about how people, ordinary people like you and I, become capable of committing crimes of genocide. It's not about the architects of genocide, the men and women who make policy and make decisions about extermination. It's not about the mid-level bureaucrats, the people like in the Holocaust and Adolf Eichmann, who keep the trains running so Jews can reach their place of appointment of death on a timely basis. But the book and my work is about the rank-and-file perpetrators, the people who actually carry out the killing in cases of genocide and mass killing. So the way I'm going to approach the ICC today and its ability, and I think tremendous potential, to confront hate internationally across the world, is to approach it from the standpoint of perpetrators and lay out for you not how the ICC should work or what its actual judicial mechanics are, but lay out for you a preliminary argument of what I see as the basic need for the International Criminal Court. The 4 decades after the end of World War II saw 150 wars and only 26 days of world peace. And that doesn't even count the innumerable internal wars and police actions. War-related deaths in the 20th century were 5 times higher than they were in the 19th century and 10 times higher than the 18th century. Now, some of that increase is obviously due to sophistication of technology, the ability for regimes often built on hate to kill, to destroy in wider numbers and over an extended period of time. But some of this is also due simply to the absolute rise in conflict that seems to have plagued us over the past several centuries. I'm concerned in my field of studies, as I mentioned to you earlier, less about this militarily sanctioned social conflict. I'm concerned more about the situations where the line, and it's often a fine line, between acceptable military conduct and criminal conduct fades, where the line between identifying so-called legitimate military combatants and aggressing against them, and aggressing against innocent men, women, and children, when that line dissolves. And when that happens, that's often what in the field we refer to as mass killings, or more often, genocide. Genocide, again, has been with us from early on in human history. But in the 20th century, we perfected genocide to an amazing degree. The 20th century began in 1904 with the destruction of some native Southwest African populations by Germans. It continued then for an 8-year period with the elimination of the Christian Armenian population by Islamic Turks between 1915 and 1923, though Turkey today still denies the existence, historical evidence of that genocide. Most scholars across the world recognize the loss of life of perhaps 1.5 million Christian Armenians simply because of their religious faith at the hands of the Islamic Turkish regime. The implementation of Soviet man-made famine in the Ukraine in 32-33, probably the mass killing and genocide we know the least about. Estimates as high as 12 million victims there at the hands of the Soviet famine. The Holocaust of 1939-45, arguably the genocide we know the most about. Nearly 6 million Jews, 2/3 of Europe's Jews lost their lives during those years. And then the rest of the 20th century just limped through massacres in Indonesia in 65 and 66, mass killings and genocide in Bangladesh, Burundi, Cambodia, East Timor, Rwanda, the former Yugoslavia, and an ongoing genocide in Sudan. Sudan's the largest country in Africa. Just 2 or 3 days ago, I was in Boston on a panel with a South Sudanese young man, 24 years of age. In Sudan now for 18 years, the Islamic regime in the north of Sudan has been trying to systematically exterminate people in the south of Sudan, either by direct physical extermination or by enslavement. And the young man who sat next to me on the panel in Boston was enslaved at the age of 7, stolen from his home in the South Sudan, taken to the North Sudan, and stayed there as a slave for 10 years before he could escape to Khartoum and eventually to the United States. Close to 2 million South Sudanese have lost their lives in this conflict. Today, 4.5 million South Sudanese are displaced from their country. That's more internally displaced people than we've had at any point in world history. As we look at this age of genocide, I think we recognize that in the tragedy of genocide, there are always 3 players, and again, I want to draw your attention to the one that we'll focus on today. Obviously, the most important, I think, of these 3 are the victims. Anyone who works in genocide studies is there primarily out of concern for victims, out of a recognition that we want to stop or decrease victimization in the future. 20th century, called the age of genocide by most people in the field, not again because genocide started in the 20th century, but in the 20th century the world got very good at committing that type of mass killing, good in terms of efficiency and productivity of death. In the 20th century, to give you some scale, I often start some of these lectures with questions of how many victims in the 20th century were victims of anti-state terrorism. Now, by anti-state terrorism, I mean the type of terrorism of 9/11, where a group has some ideologies against an existing state, and they try to influence some of those ideologies, try to influence the state in some way by inflicting terror. In the 20th century, the type of terrorism we saw on 9/11 in this country took the lives of about 500,000 people. Now contrast that. 500,000 people is a significant number, no doubt. But contrast that with the fact that the 20th century state-sponsored terrorism in the form of genocide, where a political, social, religious group says there's another group of people living in our midst that we no longer wish to live. State-sponsored terrorism took 60 million lives, conservatively estimated, in the 20th century, 120 times the toll of lives we attributed to anti-state terrorism. Bystanders are another important player in the tragedy of genocide that could have its own week dedicated to it. But again, we're here today primarily to talk about the perpetrators. One of the phrases I use in my book and my work is the phrase, humans are the weapons of genocide. In other words, sometimes I think we get kind of enamored in some odd way with Nazi technological sophistication and how that enabled them to kill nearly 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. The Nazis did ratchet up genocide in some significant ways because of technology. But by and large, if we went back a slide and we looked at all the genocides from the 20th century that I described to you very briefly, the vast majority of those have little or nothing to do with technology. What they have to do with is human beings who kill other human beings in large numbers and over an extended period of time. So the phrase I use is, human beings are the weapons of genocide. It's not technology. It's humans doing this to other humans, often motivated by hate that leads to these mass atrocities. So I want to today spend our time looking at several questions related to the International Criminal Court. And we'll start with the first one. How many, or why, does the world need a permanent international tribunal? First question we'll address under here is a question that people don't often consider. How many people does it take to carry out genocide mass killing? On the slide here you see some activities of the Einsatzgruppen from the Holocaust, which were special forces that followed the German militaries that occupied land moving eastward in Europe. These forces would follow behind several days later, and in this newly occupied Nazi territory, Third Reich land, they would round up Jews, political dissidents, homosexuals, and they would exterminate them. And often they did it in the exact way you see here on this slide. The victims digging their own graves, kneeling at the edge of a grave, and being shot and executed from behind. 1.5 million to 2 million victims in the Holocaust met their death in this exact type of way. On the slide, you can identify no fewer than 14 men lined up participating as killers in the execution. So it seems to me an important question about why we might need a permanent international tribunal has to do with how many people does it take to carry out genocide mass killing. In my course I teach on genocide studies at Whitworth, most students come into the course and they know that roughly 6 million Jews lost their life in the Holocaust. But then I ask them the corollary question, which is, how many people does it take to kill 6 million other people? Again, 6 million is a hard figure to get your mind around. If you visit the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, my friends there still have a difficult time at the end of the exhibit trying to convey what 6 million looks like. They've tried it with huge piles of hair, huge piles of eyeglasses, huge piles of shoes, but still it's hard to get your mind around 6 million. And this question in some way is similar. How many people actually have to be involved at the front line of killing and execution to kill 6 million other people? Our best estimates in the Holocaust, and obviously precise estimates are hard to come by, our best estimates in the Holocaust are perhaps as many as 500,000 Germans, Czechs, Austrians, and Poles actually committed murder, face-to-face, killing in the context of the Holocaust. Rwanda's more recent genocide, which is interesting to ask this question as well for Rwanda, beginning in April 1994, 800,000 Rwandans were killed by other Rwandans in a 100-day period. 800,000 people in 100 days. That's unlike a rate of death that we ever saw in the Holocaust or any other 20th century genocide. The killers in Rwanda literally got tired, physically exhausted from the killing process, which involved very little ammunition, mostly involved clubs and beatings and kickings and machete, the most common tool. How many perpetrators does it take to kill 800,000 people in a 100-day period? I have a colleague in Rwanda who's trying to make the case, and I think he can make the case well, that perhaps in Rwanda, for the first time in history, the number of perpetrators will outnumber the number of victims, estimating as many as 1 million perpetrators in Rwanda. How in the world could that happen? Because much of the killing in Rwanda was done by groups, often groups of young people in the capital cities of Kigali, who would gang up on 1 or 2 victims and beat or kick them to death. So clearly, despite our lack of being able to give the precise numbers, it takes an awful lot of people to commit the type of murder that we see in genocide and mass killing. Matter of fact, it takes so many people that I think you can ask a second question related to this, which is a question, does genocide overwhelm justice? In other words, does genocide involve so many people at so many different levels that justice can never really prevail in genocide? I'd argue that to this point in history, this is probably the case. I mean, think of genocidal tribunals, whether it's the Nuremberg trials in Germany, whether it's the international tribunals for Rwanda or Yugoslavia. Who are they going at? Who's on trial? The architects of genocide. Most often people who never actually killed directly, but just set policy. The mid-level bureaucrats. The rank-and-file killers that actually carry out the killing process are the ones least likely to fall victim to judicial responsibility in the years after the killing. Again, I think Rwanda is a helpful case study here. Today in Rwanda, and again understand this is 9 years after the genocide ended, you have close to 10,000 Rwandans in prison awaiting trial. all of them alleged to be involved in the genocide and the killing. Most of them probably do need to be there and do deserve to be there. Undoubtedly, some are there on charges that aren't going to stand. Some are there who weren't directly involved in the killing. But 10,000 people 9 years later that the Rwandan court system can't catch up with. Were the Rwanda tribunal left to its own devices, it's probably looking at a 30-year period before all those cases will be logged and all those cases will be brought to trial. Joe Ayala Lasso, a former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, said this, and I think it captures it very well. A person stands a better chance of being tried and judged for killing one human being than for killing 100,000. In short, I think the 20th century, the age of genocide, has clearly pointed out to us that genocide does overwhelm justice the way we do justice now. And I think the International Criminal Court, in my mind, is about a new way of doing justice. And what I want to look at for the rest of our time together is how would the ICC work? What would it do? What are its limits? And what's the role of the ICC in confronting hate? A little bit of background in terms of chronology of the International Criminal Court so you get some rough idea of where it came from. July 17, 1998, the UN did adopt a Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court to begin to put into place a permanent tribunal. 60 countries had to ratify this statute. On April 11, 2002, the 60th country ratified the Rome Statute, which meant that the International Criminal Court, thought of for over 50 years, would now actually come into place. Actually, it wasn't just one country that did the 60th ratification. There were 10 countries who all wanted the opportunity to be notified as the 60th ratifier, so they all dropped their ballots in the box at the same time. July 1st, 2002, the ICC officially entered into force. That doesn't mean that the ICC is a working judicial body right now. It's not yet. We're going to talk about that in a few moments. But it simply means that from July 1st, 2002, any war crimes, any crimes of genocide, any crimes against humanity can come before this court when it is functioning and working. Crimes committed before that date won't fall under the purview of the ICC. Most recently, March 11th, just a couple of weeks ago, the 18 judges of the ICC were sworn in. Today, the ICC has 139 signatories, people who've signed on to this treaty, and it has 89 ratifications, far past the 60 that was needed. Next month, we expect that the chief prosecutor for the ICC will be elected and appointed. Now, what are some of the roles and limits of the ICC, just very briefly to give you a broad idea of what the court is charged to do? We do already, and some of you are probably thinking of this, we have an International Court of Justice in The Hague in Netherlands, but their jurisdiction is primarily restricted to states. Okay? The International Court of Justice we have now cannot try individuals. All they do is try states who are accused of the crime of genocide. The ICC, though, will fill an important missing link in international law because the ICC will have the capacity to try individuals for genocide, for war crimes, and for crimes against humanity. And I should point out here that the phrase crimes against humanity, and we'll come back to this at the end of today, does include crimes of terrorism. That the ICC, were it in place at the time, would have been responsible for bringing to justice Osama bin Laden. The ICC will not supplant or will not replace national jurisdiction. I think this is one of the most common misconceptions of the ICC, is that now we have some type of world government that will take over national jurisdiction. The ICC only complements national jurisdiction. The ICC will come into play in only one of two cases, and that is where a state is either unwilling or unable to investigate or prosecute alleged war criminals. So if a state harbors war criminals that commit crimes of genocide or crimes against humanity, and the state says we will not prosecute them for whatever reason, the ICC will take over the jurisdiction of doing that. If, on the other hand, a state like Rwanda does choose to try to prosecute its war criminals, but they can't do it, they're unable to do it, the ICC could step in those cases. So the ICC is complementary to national jurisdiction, and it's only going to act when a state chooses not to exercise its sovereignty or is unable to exercise its sovereignty. And the main purpose of the ICC, and I think it very much relates to the purpose of this conference, is in issues of confronting hate, and the ICC is a judicial aim to try and have a deterrent effect on future war criminals. I mean, this is one of the points I try to make in my book. If you're a political, social, religious group and you want to commit genocide, there are a lot of things you may have to worry about and a lot of things you may be hesitant about, but you should never be worried about judicial prosecution. You should never be worried about being brought to justice on an international level, because it doesn't happen often enough to be a legitimate concern for you if you're contemplating genocidal activities. And when it happens primarily to the architects. But if you're a citizen of a country and you're going to be a mid-level bureaucrat or you're going to be a rank-and-file killer in genocide, the fear of prosecution after it's over really is not that salient to you, because history has shown us it just doesn't happen that often. The fear is not worthy enough to really constrain or restrict your behavior in any significant way. The ICC is meant to be that aura out there. It's meant to be the fear, the thought that at least we could place in some country's mind or in the citizens of countries' minds that, after this is all said and done, there will be attempts to prosecute and there will be attempts to punish. Now, how has the world responded to the ICC? I think the world's response has been very positive. This statute has been ratified overwhelmingly by the world's leading democracies. The parties that are signed on to the ICC are disproportionately made up of our EU and NATO allies, including the United Kingdom. So the ICC does include the presumption of innocence, which is not unique to Western justice, but certainly is not universal across the world. It does include the right to counsel. It does include the right to confront one's accusers. And it does include the right to a speedy trial. So on the basis of those type of negotiations and involvement in the ICC, President Clinton signed the U.S. as a signatory on the Rome Statute on December 31st, 2000, his last day in office. And when he signed it, I want to be clear that it wasn't necessarily an enthusiastic signing. It was a recognition that there were still a lot of kinks in the ICC to be worked out, but it seemed to be close enough to be in the permanent international tribunal of justice that the world needed, that Clinton and the U.S. and the Clinton administration felt that the U.S. could sign on to it. Now, immediately, and actually during this whole process, there was some congressional opposition, primarily from conservative Republicans, to our involvement in the ICC. And it came mainly from Jesse Helms, North Carolina, John Warner of Virginia, and then later Tom DeLay of Texas. And Helms began the process with what he called an American Service Members Protection Act that basically said there's absolutely no way in the world we're going to put American men and women, military personnel, in a position of ever being judged by an international tribunal. Again, it was an issue of sovereignty. Helms argued that the ICC was not consistent enough with the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. judicial system, to put our men and women in harm's way in this way. And that amendment, or that act, never actually makes it through Congress, but definitely sets a tone of opposition to the presidential Clinton involvement in the ICC. When the Bush administration came into power, it was clear from the very beginning that the Bush administration was not going to be supportive of America's role in the ICC. On May 6, 2002, the Bush administration took an unprecedented move. This has never happened in the history of UN treaties over nearly 55 years. And in this move, basically unsigned the treaty that we had signed in 2000 to nullify the Clinton administration's signature of the Rome Statute. And as the Bush administration again made that unprecedented move of unsigning the statute, basically it pulled America out of any role in the ICC. We're no longer involved in how the ICC works, how it functions. The 18 judges that have been sworn in for the ICC, none of them will be American. The prosecutor will not be American. Basically, we've disconnected ourselves completely from the work of the ICC. Now, I think finally, and I think this is perhaps most important, and it's something that seems to me that many opponents of the ICC miss, that by not being involved in the ICC, it restricts our options for how we deal with many atrocities committed across the world. And most recently, if we look at the acts of 9/11 attributed to Osama bin Laden, those acts are easily understood as crimes against humanity in the ICC statute. And rather than see a war on terrorism, the ICC sees terrorism as a criminal activity, and it finds, prosecutes, and punishes criminals who have committed those terrorist activities. For Americans, though, because we weren't involved in the ICC, the option of seeing Osama bin Laden as an international criminal of some type was pretty restricted. And what we were pushed to was to see Osama bin Laden in the context of a military confrontation. I think similarly, I would argue this is much of what has happened with Saddam Hussein's regime, which again, by definition in the ICC, the genocidal acts against the Kurds easily fit within the ICC purview, and Hussein, again, could be prosecuted and punished as a criminal from the standpoint of the ICC as it begins its work as a functioning organ. But again, because America is not involved in what seems to me to be an important international judicial tribunal, our options of how we deal with Hussein were restricted in some ways, and obviously restricted in ways that over the past week has affected all of our lives. Now, I want to conclude by saying that I know the ICC is not going to be the perfect answer, and it may not accomplish all the things it sets out to do. But for over 50 years, our world has tried to understand, how do you confront the hate that perpetrators of genocide and mass killing bring? And I think one of the significant ways we confront that is judicially, through processes of international law and through the development of a tribunal like this. And for over 50 years, a lot of people have given a large portion of their lives to trying to bring something like the ICC to reality. And it's here now. And I think as Americans, we have to ask ourselves, what are we losing because we're not part of it? And in what ways is the ICC going to change the face of international reactions to perpetrators of hate, crimes against humanity, and crimes of genocide?
On behalf of our staff at the North Idaho College Public Forum, we want to again express our deep appreciation to Dr. James Waller, Professor of Psychology at Whitworth College, for the segments of his keynote address that he gave at North Idaho College that we have aired today with you on our program. Dr. Waller is a great professor and human being who addresses a very important topic, and we thank him very much. We would like to invite you to be with us again next week on the 12th week of this special series and the closing week on the topic of confronting hate, humanity's greatest challenge. On that final program, we will be taking excerpts from a panel of experts on how to use the courts in confronting hate. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.